David Carter took a slow sip of bourbon, relishing the smooth burn, and picked up his iPad. A message had come in from his wife, Megan, informing him, once again, that she'd be working late. He should take care of dinner himself, she'd said, as if it were a passing thought. David, ever the meticulous planner, decided to make the most of his free evening. His plan revolved around grabbing a cheeseburger from Whataburger, diving into Matt Ryan's latest Jack Reacher novel, and savoring a rare bottle of Milam and green 13-year-old bourbon, a gift from his father-in-law he had been saving for the perfect moment. Tonight, he decided, was that moment. Setting the iPad down on the end table, David took another sip of the amber liquid, its 111 proof potency warming him as he reflected on the state of his life. Megan, his wife of 6 years, had been buried in work for the last 6 months, logging countless overtime hours. Early in their marriage, they had agreed to contribute equally to a joint account for shared expenses and vacations, while keeping their personal savings, checking, and retirement accounts entirely separate. Megan had insisted on this arrangement, and David, still in the throes of love at the time, hadn't questioned it. Unlike David, who owned his own business, Megan's income as a salaried accountant for a Fortune 500 company wasn't affected by her overtime hours. Whether she worked 40 or 60 hours a week, her paycheck remained the same. However, Megan's insistence on financial independence left David in the dark about whether her overtime was even financially worthwhile. The contributions to their joint account were more than enough to cover expenses, and the surplus had quietly grown over the years. Yet this financial arrangement, which Megan had enforced before their marriage, sometimes left David feeling as though they were living separate lives. Back when they first met, David's auto repair business was struggling. The economy was down, and there were months he couldn't afford to pay himself. Running a business meant prioritizing his employees over his own needs, and David refused to lay off a single worker. Instead, he drained his personal savings to keep the business afloat. Night after night, he locked up his shops, exhausted and demoralized, knowing he had just enough to survive another day. Megan, who was earning a stable income, had been supportive but distant, keeping her own finances and emotions at arm's length from the challenges David faced. Despite the hardships, David persevered. What began as 3 inherited auto repair shops had blossomed into a thriving chain of 12 locations. Over the past few years, he had even secured options on land that would allow him to expand to 20 locations in the next 3 years. By reinvesting the business's profits into top-tier equipment, such as tire machines that could handle any size wheel and state-of-the-art diagnostic tools, David ensured his shops stayed competitive and efficient. Although the business was solidly in the black, David deliberately kept his own salary modest, prioritizing growth over personal gain. Things should have been idyllic. Megan's career was stable, David's business was booming, and financially, they were more secure than ever. Yet cracks had started to form in their marriage. This was a second marriage for both of them. David's first wife, Emma, had tragically passed away when she was hit by an elderly driver during one of her early morning runs. It was a crisp, sunny October morning, and the glare from the rising sun blinded the elderly driver as they navigated a street where a torn-up sidewalk forced Emma to run on the road. About 20 feet. That was all. Just 20 cursed feet. 5 seconds of running, and 2 lives were tragically extinguished. Emma hadn't known it at the time, but she was 4 weeks pregnant when she was struck by the car. This was the second devastating loss to strike the Carter family. David's mother had passed away from lung cancer during his high school years, despite never having smoked a day in her life. When she developed a persistent cough and sought treatment, it was already too late. Within 8 weeks of her diagnosis, she was gone. Losing Emma and their unborn child left David in pieces. His father stepped in, installing an acting manager at the shop David ran to give him the space and time he needed to grieve. For a long time, David didn't know if he'd ever fully recover, but fate, or perhaps cruel necessity, had other plans. His father suffered a fatal coronary while driving home from work one evening, and David was forced to put his grief aside to focus on the business. Employees depended on him, and there was no time to wallow in pain when others' livelihoods were on the line. It was in the midst of this whirlwind that David met Megan. An apprentice mechanic had carelessly removed a radiator cap from an overheated engine, just as David was walking by. A spray of scalding antifreeze covered his chest, forcing him to visit the emergency room. The ER was its usual chaotic self. Overdoses, injuries from drunken mishaps, and head wounds filled the waiting area. David, smelling faintly of sweet but unpleasant antifreeze, found an empty seat. Moments later, a tall brunette limped over and dropped into the chair next to him. Megan, it turned out, had twisted her ankle during an after-work run. With hours to kill in the overcrowded ER, they struck up a conversation about their injuries and their lives. There was an immediate connection, and when David asked Megan to dinner, she said yes. Their relationship blossomed quickly. Megan had left her first husband due to his emotional abuse and infidelity and made it clear from the start that she had zero tolerance for betrayal. 15 months later, they were married. For the first few years, their marriage was a joyful whirlwind. They laughed together, danced often, and couldn't keep their hands off each other. But things began to shift after Megan completed her MBA and landed a coveted position as an accountant for a Fortune 500 company. David was nothing but supportive, wanting Megan to thrive and feel accomplished. When a senior vice president announced their upcoming retirement, and Megan's immediate supervisor looked poised to take the role, Megan saw an opportunity for herself to climb the corporate ladder. She just needed to prove her worth. That ambition, however, seemed to come at a cost. Megan started to change. She became irritable, picking fights over trivial matters, and began making snide remarks about David's job. "You're just a mechanic," she'd sneer. "A grease monkey." Her attitude shifted dramatically, and her respect for him waned with every passing day. She was glued to her phone at all hours, often laughing at private messages she refused to share. She slept with her phone tucked under her pillow and turned the screen away whenever David was nearby. It wasn't just the secrecy that stung, it was the growing chasm between them. Her temper, once fiery but short-lived, grew more volatile. What used to be harmless barbs now turned into prolonged arguments, often leaving no room for reconciliation. A month ago, during one particularly heated fight, Megan slapped David. It shocked him to his core, not just the physical act, but the person she had become. Megan, too, seemed surprised by her own actions, apologizing profusely and begging for forgiveness. Yet, things only escalated. A week later, during another argument, Megan threw a coffee cup at David's head. He barely ducked in time to avoid being hit squarely on the forehead. Megan's reaction? She turned and walked away without a word, leaving David to grapple with the realization that the woman he married no longer existed. As David sat in his chair sipping bourbon that evening, he heard the garage door open. Megan was home. Picking up his phone, he sent off a text and email he had already prepared, both redundant, ensuring his message got through. "If the right one doesn't get you, then the left one will," he thought, recalling an old Johnny Reed song. Megan swept through the living room, glancing briefly at David. "I'm going to change, and then we need to talk about some strange activity on the joint account," she announced flatly, not waiting for a response before heading to the bedroom. David listened to the sound of the shower starting, knowing exactly what was coming next. 15 minutes later, Megan returned to the living room. She wore black yoga pants and a snug, white midriff-bearing t-shirt, her damp hair slicked back. Even without makeup, she was stunning. Her lean, athletic frame and flawless features accentuated her beauty. But David had long stopped being dazzled by her appearance. "So," Megan said, holding up her phone, "do you know anything about these charges from the joint account?" Her tone carried a sharp edge, accusatory and biting. She turned the screen toward David, displaying the day's bank activity. The balance, which had been over $30,000 earlier, now sat at $12. David nodded. "The $12,000 charge to Pendragon Security Consultants? That was for a month of surveillance to document your affair with your boss. The $18,000? That went to Solomon, Klein, and Davis, my divorce attorneys." He took a deliberate sip of bourbon, his eyes locked on Megan's face. Her expression morphed from shock to despair as tears welled in her eyes. Her mouth opened and closed uselessly, her face flushing bright red. For a moment, Megan looked like a fish out of water, gasping for air, as she struggled to find a response. David waited, unflinching, for what came next. Megan seemed utterly lost for words as David watched the emotions flicker across her face. Fear shifting to sadness, then morphing into anger, only to cycle back to fear. She appeared paralyzed by indecision, and it wasn't until David calmly picked up his bourbon glass for another sip that she finally decided what to say. "It didn't mean anything," Megan stammered. "I just got caught up in something I couldn't control. I'll end it right now. I don't want a divorce." David tilted his head, his gaze steady. "Weren't you the one who said you had zero tolerance for cheaters? What did that mean to you?" Megan's eyes dropped to her clenched hands in her lap. "If you ever cheated on me, I would divorce you," she muttered. David nodded slowly. "That sounds like a solid plan." "I don't want a divorce," Megan repeated, her voice more urgent now. David leaned forward, resting his glass on the table. "And what exactly did you think would happen when I found out?" "I didn't think you would find out," she admitted honestly. I thought it would run its course, and you and I could get back to normal." David raised an eyebrow, his tone calm but cutting. "And the disrespect? The anger? The abuse? Was I just supposed to let all of that go?" Megan's voice rose defensively. "I never disrespected you, and there wasn't any abuse." David's eyes hardened. "Did you sleep with him in our bed?" The blood drained from Megan's face, and she gasped softly. "Yes," she whispered, "but I didn't mean to disrespect you." David's laughter was bitter and sharp. "Oh, well, that makes it all better. As long as you didn't mean to disrespect me, then we're good, right? You had intimacy with him in our bed, in our home, and you somehow think that wasn't disrespectful?" Megan's eyes glistened with tears as David continued. "And as for no abuse, let's recap. You slapped me. You threw a coffee cup at my head. So, yeah, Megan, there was abuse. We can get past this," Megan insisted desperately. "I don't want a divorce. We can fix this. I'll make an appointment for a marriage counselor." David shook his head. "Our marriage wasn't the problem. Your cheating was the problem. And while I agree counseling is needed, it's not for us as a couple. You need to figure out what's broken in you. Let's be real. If your boyfriend were single, you'd have left me the moment he asked. But he's not, so I'm plan B." He scoffed. "Well, not anymore. I do not want a divorce," Megan said emphatically. David smiled faintly. "You'll change your mind." All the while, Megan's phone had been vibrating with notifications. She ignored them, her focus locked on David. When a call finally came through, she glanced at the screen in annoyance. "You should probably take that," David said, his voice calm. Megan rose from the sofa, retreating to the bedroom for privacy. David watched her leave, then picked up his phone, tapping a few pre-open apps and hitting the post button. From the bedroom, he heard Megan's muffled voice, which grew louder until she exclaimed, "He did what?" Moments later, Megan stormed back into the living room, her face flushed with rage. "You told his wife?" she screamed. "How dare you try to destroy his marriage? You had no right. They have 2 little boys. How could you be so hateful?" David regarded her with quiet bemusement. "So, let me get this straight. He's not a sorry excuse for a man for cheating on his wife, but I'm the bad guy for telling her? That's some twisted logic, babe." Megan glared at him, her voice shaking with anger. "This is between you and me. You had no business interfering in their marriage." David shook his head. "Your boyfriend had no problem interfering in our marriage. And if he's cheating with a co-worker, who knows who else he's been with? His wife deserves the truth and a chance to protect herself. She should get tested for STIs. And since you're clearly having unprotected intimacy with him, you should too. I already got tested, just for my peace of mind, since we haven't been intimate in months." Megan looked at David as if he were a stranger. "You knew for months?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. David shrugged. "Yep. Hired private investigators, gathered proof. Just biding my time." "You're pathetic," Megan spat. "This was just about payback for you." David remained calm, noticing once again that her phone was vibrating with more notifications. As she paused to catch her breath, the phone began ringing. "You should probably take that," David said again, sipping his bourbon. Megan stormed off to the bedroom once more. As soon as she left, David made a quick call on his iPhone. mumbling briefly into the receiver before setting it to record and placing it on the end table, the camera pointed toward himself. He leaned back in his chair, waiting. It didn't take long. Megan re-entered the living room in a rage. "You posted this on Facebook?" she screamed. "And you tagged all my family and friends? Pastor Evans?" David didn't flinch. "Well, yes. But to be fair, I also posted it on LinkedIn. I figured your professional connections should know too." Megan let out a scream of pure frustration, hurling her phone at David's head. He braced himself, but the impact was worse than he expected. The phone struck his forehead with enough force to make him see stars. Blood trickled down his face as Megan launched herself at him, fists flying. "You miserable!" she shrieked, her voice ragged. "I'll kill you! I'll blow your head off!" David endured the assault as long as he could before gently pushing her off and stepping away, putting a love seat between them. At that moment, the doorbell rang. "You should probably get that," David said evenly. Megan's nostrils flared as she glared at him, then turned and stomped to the door. When she opened it, 2 police officers stood on the porch. Her expression shifted from anger to confusion. After a brief conversation, one officer stepped inside and approached David. "Mr. Carter, I'm Patrolman Diaz. Your wife says you've been violent toward her tonight. Why don't you tell me what's going on? Did you touch her?" David shook his head, his voice steady. "No. I confronted my wife about her affair, and she attacked me." David pointed to the blood trickling down his face from where Megan's cell phone had struck him. His split lip throbbed, and he could feel the sticky warmth on his cheek. "I'm the one who called 911, he told Patrolman Diaz. "She's been getting increasingly violent. A month ago, she slapped me. A week later, she threw a coffee cup at my head. It missed, but if it had hit, I'd have ended up in the emergency room. I recorded tonight's confrontation. Would you like to see the video?" Patrolman Diaz raised an eyebrow. "Absolutely," he said. David unlocked his phone, tapped through a few screens, and handed it over. The officer watched the video in silence, his eyebrows climbing higher when Megan was shown launching herself at David. "Was there anything said before the recording started that might have escalated things?" Diaz asked, his tone skeptical. David shrugged. "She found out I had a private investigator follow her for a month, and that I shared the findings with her affair partner's wife. She didn't take it well." The officer chuckled. "You don't mess around, do you?" David smirked faintly. "I prefer lighting my path forward with the flames of the bridges I've burned." The officer laughed quietly. "Okay, Dylan McKay." He shook his head, still smiling, as he stepped away to confer with his partner. The second officer, who had just emerged from the kitchen, listened to the playback of the video and rolled his eyes. Megan's explanation, apparently, had been wildly different from what the officers were now seeing. Patrolman Diaz returned to David. "We're arresting your wife for domestic violence and making terroristic threats. I strongly recommend taking out a restraining order." The officer opened the front door as his partner escorted Megan out of the kitchen, her hands cuffed behind her back. Tears streamed down her face, and she was beginning to hyperventilate. "David, don't let them do this to me," she begged. "Please, if you ever loved me, make them let me go. I promise I'll be good." David rolled his eyes as one of the officers handed him a business card. "My email's on there," Diaz said. "Send me a copy of that video." David watched from the doorway as the squad car drove away, then called his attorney, Dwight Solomon. "It went down just like I figured," he said. "She's in jail now." "Good," Dwight replied. "Stay calm. If she tries anything tomorrow, you know what to do." The next morning, Megan left the courthouse flanked by her parents, visibly tired and annoyed. A young, gum-chewing blonde intercepted her. "Excuse me," the woman said, stepping into Megan's path. "Are you Megan Carter?" "Yes," Megan replied wearily. "Who are you?" "You've been served," the blonde announced, shoving a manila envelope into Megan's hands before turning and walking away. "What is this?" Megan shouted after her. The blonde didn't stop. "Don't know, don't care," she called back. "But I guess it's not good." Megan ripped open the envelope and scanned the top of the papers. The words "petition for dissolution of marriage" leaped off the page. Her face turned red with fury. "That son of a bitch!" she screamed at her parents. The morning had been a nightmare. Megan had been woken early and moved to a holding cell, where she sat for over an hour before meeting her attorney. The night before, she had used her one phone call to contact her parents, who scrambled to hire the first lawyer who returned their calls. By the time of her hearing, Megan was disheveled and exhausted. The judge set her bond at $10,000 and issued a restraining order prohibiting her from contacting David or appearing at their home or his workplace. She would need to arrange with her attorney to retrieve her belongings. Her lawyer had objected until shown photos of David's injuries. At that point, the objection was quietly withdrawn. Megan's parents took her to McDonald's after court since she hadn't eaten since her romantic evening with Greg Hall at a cheap motel. The plan to grab leftovers from the fridge at home had clearly fallen apart. She replayed the events in her head, starting with the ding of her phone while Greg dozed beside her. She'd assumed it was a text from David, but had instead found a bank notification. Her joint account with David had been nearly emptied. 2 withdrawals, $12,000 and $18,000, stood out. At first, she suspected a scam or bank error. David wasn't one to avoid confrontation. If he suspected anything, he would have said something. But as she glanced at Greg, whose mediocrity was becoming harder to ignore, Megan wondered how she had even ended up in this mess. Megan had always relied on her looks and cunning. High school had been a playground of manipulation, from seducing Mr. Harris for an A+ in calculus to letting Ms. Williams tutor her in economics. College had been no different. Professors of both genders fell under her spell when grades faltered. Marrying Ryan Blake had been a turning point. Their relationship began hot and heavy, full of passion, and she truly believed they had a strong foundation. But life wasn't always as easy as Megan expected, and her choices, often self-serving and impulsive, seemed destined to lead her down darker paths. Now, sitting in the back seat of her parents' car, clutching divorce papers, Megan couldn't help but wonder. Had she finally played a game she couldn't win? Ryan Blake had been offered a prestigious opportunity to attend a 4-week course run by the Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, and Firearms. Although it meant being away for a month, the credentials from the ATF training would significantly bolster his chances of future promotions. For Ryan, the decision was a no-brainer. Meanwhile, Megan managed fine during the first week of his absence, but by the second, loneliness began to creep in. By the third week, she was crawling up the walls, her horniness amplified by both her solitude and her hormonal frustration. She resorted to self-soothing twice a day, but found little relief. During the fourth week, Megan accepted an invitation from Mark Wallace, a former partner of Ryan's from the Denton County Sheriff's Department, to go out for drinks. Megan knew that Ryan and Mark were no longer friends, though she wasn't entirely sure what had caused their falling out. She told herself the drinks were harmless and that perhaps she could even mend fences between the two men. Besides, Mark was handsome and she was lonely. What harm could come of it? Ryan, meanwhile, excelled in the ATF course, leading the class rankings. In the final week, his top position earned him the chance to take the exam 3 days early. Passing meant he could leave the course ahead of schedule, and Ryan aced it with flying colors. Within hours, he was on a flight back to DFW, eager to surprise Megan. It was 4 a.m. when Ryan's Uber dropped him off at the house. He noticed Mark's car parked in the driveway. A cold knot formed in his stomach as he unlocked the door and stepped inside. Leaving his suitcase by the door, he walked softly toward the bedroom, where light spilled out from the en-suite bathroom. Inside, Mark lay uncovered on his back, and Megan was curled up beside him, her arm draped over his chest in the same familiar way she always slept with Ryan. Ryan's hands shook as he pulled out his phone, filming the scene for about 30 seconds before snapping a few photos. Then he put his phone away, walked to Mark's side of the bed, clasped his hands together, and brought them crashing down onto Mark's groin with all his strength. The blood-curdling scream that erupted jolted Megan awake from her post-coital slumber. Disoriented, she stared at the scene. Mark curled up, clutching his groin, and her husband standing over them, his face a mask of fury. As realization dawned on Megan, her face twisted in horror. Ryan's voice was low, but filled with venom. "I'll be back at 3 o'clock to get my things. I should be done by 6 o'clock. Don't be here. I won't be responsible for my actions if I see you, and you're not worth losing my job over." Turning to Mark, Ryan grabbed a fistful of his hair, forcing him to meet his gaze. "You sorry piece of crap. I'm sending that video to your wife and HR. Your career's over. Your marriage? Done." He punctuated his statement with a punch to Mark's nose, enough to draw blood but not to break it, before walking out, leaving Megan to stare after him in stunned silence. Megan sighed as she recalled the aftermath. Ryan had been devastated by her betrayal, and he refused every attempt she made to contact him. He wouldn't see her, speak to her, or entertain the idea of reconciliation. The divorce went through swiftly, with her parents rallying around her. They told her it wasn't her fault, claiming Ryan's actions during the confrontation showed a violent streak that would have doomed their marriage sooner or later. Over time, Megan began rewriting the narrative, convincing herself, and anyone who would listen, that she was the real victim. She built her story around neglect and abuse, painting herself as a brave woman who had to escape a brute. Only once was her fiction shattered. 5 years later, while shopping in Dallas, Megan ran into Ryan. He was with a tall, gorgeous redhead pushing a pram. Megan's stomach dropped as recognition hit. "Hi, Ryan," she stammered. "Hello, Megan," he replied, his tone neutral. Megan extended her hand to the woman. Magan. I used to be married to Ryan." "Oh, I've heard all about you," the woman replied coolly, shaking Megan's hand. "I'm Samantha Blake, Ryan's wife. And this is our son, Ryan Jr." Megan's forced smile wavered as she looked at the sleeping baby. "He's beautiful. You're lucky to have Ryan. He's a good man." Samantha smiled politely. "Yes, I know." Ryan said nothing, his contempt clear as he took Samantha's hand and walked away, pushing the pram toward the men's department. Later that evening, Megan watched the news and realized why Samantha looked familiar. She was a rising media star, likely bound for national television. For the next week, Megan cried herself to sleep. Then she forced herself to remember her fiction. Ryan had been violent and emotionally abusive, hadn't he? Surely, this new marriage would end the same way. Back in the present, Megan snapped out of her thoughts as she finished her Egg McMuffin. She demanded her parents drive her to her former home. "That's not a good idea," her father warned. "I need to talk to David. We can work through this," Megan insisted. "Megan," her mother said hesitantly, "the judge." "I don't care what the judge said," Megan snapped. At the house, Megan rang the doorbell repeatedly. When there was no answer, she began pounding on the door. Inside, David made a quick phone call before opening the door with the security chain still in place. "You're not supposed to be here," he said flatly. "There's a restraining order." "I live here," Megan shouted. "How can we fix our marriage if I'm not here?" David's expression hardened. "Fix? I'm divorcing you. There's nothing to fix. I'm not staying married to a lying, abusive cheater." He closed the door, and Megan's anger boiled over. "Let me in, you coward. You've never seen abuse until I'm through with you," she screamed, pounding frantically. Her parents joined in, shouting threats and demands. "You grease monkey," Megan's father roared. "I'll put you down, boy." David calmly sipped his coffee, watching the chaos unfold on his doorbell camera. Moments later, a squad car pulled into the driveway. 2 officers approached the porch. Megan and her parents turned to face them, their shouting growing louder as the officers began speaking. After a brief consultation, one of the officers broke away from the group and rang the doorbell. David Carter opened the door and invited the officer inside. After confirming David's identification, the officer asked for his side of the story, noticing the cuts and bruises on David's face. "Last night, I confronted my wife about an affair she's having. I have proof because I hired a private investigator. During the confrontation, she became violent and attacked me," David explained, gesturing toward the visible bruising. "She was arrested last night, appeared in court this morning, and was issued a restraining order forbidding her from entering this property." David handed the officer a copy of the temporary restraining order his attorney had emailed him. "I also have this," he added, pulling out his phone. He played a video showing Megan and her parents banging on the door and making threats. The officer shook his head as he watched. "Well, this seems pretty cut and dried. Send me a copy of the video," the officer said, handing David a business card. He then keyed his shoulder mic and requested 2 additional squad cars for multiple arrests. Stay inside and watch from your phone. Don't leave the house until I give the all clear, the officer instructed. David complied, returning to his living room and watching the scene unfold on his doorbell camera. Outside, the officers reviewed the video again and approached Megan and her parents. They informed them that all 3 were being arrested for trespassing and making terroristic threats, with Megan facing additional charges for violating the restraining order. As 2 more squad cars arrived, the officers began the arrests. Megan's mother, Diane, became hysterical, sobbing uncontrollably, while Megan herself cried and cursed at the officers. Greg Keyes, Megan's father, tried to push past the officers to reach his wife, but was swiftly tackled to the ground. It was David mused as he sipped his coffee, a scene worthy of a reality show. He called his attorney and left a brief message. Megan and both her parents were just arrested. I think I married into a family of idiots. Greg Keyes was feeling utterly defeated. Arrested alongside his wife and daughter on Friday night for trespassing and threatening his son-in-law, the 3 of them had spent the entire weekend in jail, waiting to see a judge on Monday morning. When their case was heard, Greg and Diane were issued restraining orders barring them from David's home and business. Megan, however, wasn't as lucky. Her bail was revoked, and she was ordered to remain in jail for violating the protective order and making terroristic threats. Greg bonded himself and Diane out, but the knowledge that Megan would remain behind bars for the foreseeable future weighed heavily on him. As he sat in his kitchen later that day, he couldn't shake the feeling that he had failed as a father. Megan was spoiled, entitled, and likely a narcissist, but she was still his little girl. Diane had spent the weekend sharing a cell with Megan, but she had been tight-lipped about whatever conversations they'd had. When Diane returned home, she seemed unusually angry and determined, though Greg had no idea why. Determined to help his daughter, Greg called the attorney who had represented Megan during her first arrest. After Greg explained the situation, the attorney commiserated with him, but admitted he was heading out on vacation and wouldn't be available. While this was true, the attorney also had no interest in dealing with the Keyes family again, having concluded they were too much trouble. Frustrated, Greg turned to the yellow pages and began calling attorneys until he found one who could see him immediately. If Greg had known more about the legal profession, the attorney's instant availability would have been an obvious red flag. Victor Malone was nobody's ideal of a competent attorney. Skinny, balding, with a hooked nose and narrow, predatory eyes, he resembled a buzzard perched on a power line, waiting for its prey to die so he could swoop in. A line from a long-forgotten literature class flitted through Greg's mind, something about a lean and hungry look. Victor's office was cluttered with mismatched furniture and stacks of paper teetering precariously on every available surface. Unlike more reputable attorneys who advertised on TV or billboards, Victor's business came from the dregs of word-of-mouth referrals and bargain basement legal directories. Yet Greg was desperate and willing to give him a chance. Victor listened intently as Greg explained the situation, nodding occasionally but offering little in terms of reassurance. The more Greg spoke, the more Victor's eyes gleamed with the possibility of wringing every last dollar out of this family drama. Greg, oblivious to Victor's true nature, hoped he had found someone who could help Megan, and by extension, salvage his own sense of paternal pride. Victor Malone looked every bit the kind of lawyer who might advertise on bus stop benches or leave cards in the back rooms of massage parlors. With his predatory grin and sharp, calculating demeanor, he immediately latched onto the business card Greg Keyes handed him from Megan's divorce packet. However, the grin quickly faltered as Victor read the name on the card. Solomon, Klein, and Davis? Wait, you said your son-in-law was a mechanic. How can he afford SKD on a mechanic's salary? Greg shrugged. He owns a few auto shops. I don't think he actually works on the cars. Victor rolled his eyes and turned to his computer for answers. A quick search of David Carter Automotive brought up the chain of 12 repair shops David owned. Victor's eyes gleamed. 12 locations, huh? This looks promising. Your daughter could be in for a good chunk of change. Heck, we might even get him to cover my fees. Though Victor didn't literally rub his hands together in glee, it wasn't hard to imagine him doing so. However, his cocky attitude took a nosedive when he reached out to David's attorney, Dwight Solomon. Victor had demanded an immediate meeting with David and his attorney to discuss temporary spousal maintenance. Dwight's response was blunt and to the point. Go screw yourself. Then the line went dead. Victor stared at his phone in disbelief, immediately dialing Dwight back with every intention of giving him a piece of his mind. But as soon as the call connected, Dwight cut him off. What part of go screw yourself didn't you understand? Without waiting for a reply, Dwight hung up again. Victor fumed, muttering to himself. Fine, you want to play hardball? We'll play hardball. By the time Victor managed to secure a meeting with Solomon, Klein, and Davis, he'd already stepped into a nightmare. The reception he received at their offices was less than welcoming. The receptionist barely masked her disdain as she directed him to a small conference room. Someone will fetch you shortly, she said, using the word fetch as though Victor were a dog awaiting a stick to be thrown. Victor stewed in the cramped room for 20 minutes before a young-looking woman entered. To Victor, she seemed barely out of high school. He dismissed her immediately. The woman, however, was Sophia Ellis, a 32-year-old Yale law graduate and junior partner at SKD, known for her sharp mind and ruthless efficiency. Victor launched into a list of demands on behalf of his clients, unaware of the amused, almost predatory gleam in Sophia's eyes. When he finished, Sophia dismantled his case piece by piece. They had video evidence of Megan attacking David, violating the restraining order, and making death threats. They also had recordings of Greg and Diane Keyes making threats of their own. And, to Victor's dismay, David and Megan had signed a prenuptial agreement that Victor's clients had conveniently failed to mention. Victor left the meeting humiliated and livid. When he returned to his office, he erupted at Greg, Diane, and Megan. Why didn't you tell me about the videos? Or the prenup? You made me look like a fool. As he ranted, he realized this family was more trouble than they were worth. I'm done with you as clients, he snapped. Here's my invoice for the time you wasted. Get out of my office. In the final divorce meeting, Megan sat across the table from David, dressed impeccably. She wanted him to see what he was giving up, to regret his decision to leave her. But David sat impassively, unfazed by her efforts. The terms of the divorce were straightforward. Both parties would retain what they had brought into the marriage. David, having purchased the house during his first marriage, would keep it. Megan had always seen this as a sign that David wasn't fully committed to her, but David viewed it as a subconscious acknowledgement that she couldn't be trusted. Both, it seemed, had been right. As part of the agreement, Megan returned her wedding set, sliding it across the table in an envelope. David removed his wedding ring and placed it on the table in front of her without fanfare. When all was said and done, David had one final question for Megan. Why? You had a good life. I know you loved me, and I loved you. Why would you throw it all away for a fling? Megan sighed, tilting her head back for a moment before meeting his gaze. I don't know. Boredom? Restlessness? Maybe to increase my chances of getting promoted. A little bit of all three, I guess. What do you want me to say? She hesitated before continuing. Do you regret cheating? I regret getting caught. But I don't regret the affair or the intimacy. It's who I am. You were a good husband. I just wasn't a good wife, and I don't think I'll ever be a good wife for anyone. David nodded, her answer confirming what he'd already known. Megan gathered her purse and papers, turning to leave. Megan, David called after her. She turned, her expression expectant. He pointed to his wedding ring still sitting on the table. You should probably take that. And so, the final chapter of their story closed. Was this the ending you expected? Did it take a turn you didn't see coming? Let me know your thoughts, and let's get a conversation started. If you found this story gripping, don't forget to like and subscribe for more compelling tales. Thanks for reading, and I'll see you in the next one.